Primitive War by Ethan Pettus, Chapter 12. Xavier struggled to keep his eyes open. The warm embrace of his hammock was an intoxicating pleasure in the cold, damp air. The rest of the squad was already asleep, bushwhacked from the long night of hiking. Xavier knuckled the grit from the corner of his eye and checked his watch, 4:45 a.m. With a weary sigh, he sank further down into his hammock. Tree frogs chirped and creaked from overhanging branches. Crickets played music from the grass. Xavier could feel himself fall into the peace of the moment, carried away by the river's soft ambient gurgle. He could feel himself sliding through the water, flowing over stones and shallow bends, drifting beneath a sunless sky to the distant horizon. Xavier blinked. He checked his watch, 4:47. He distracted himself with the thoughts of his childhood, where the forests of Maine had been his true home. His father had been Abenaki, his mother was white. Xavier inherited his mother's skin, but he carried his father's heart. His father raised him to be a hunter. Tracking was in Xavier's blood. He didn't care for school or sports. He dropped out when he was 16. He spent his adolescence in the mountains with his father, hunting and fishing, learning to find the most indecipherable animal tracks in the brush. His hunter's heart had led him to Vermont, where he lived off the grid in the Green Mountains until he turned 18 and eventually to Vietnam to serve his fellow soldiers as a guide and a medic in the deadliest jungle in the world. Xavier had carried his hunter's heart through Vietnam. While most men were terrified of Vietnam's elusive wilderness, Xavier was enthralled. He knew his placement in the jungle. He always understood that he was both predator and prey. He affirmed his rightful place at the top of the food chain, with memories of hunting deer with a homemade bow and arrow, and killing black bear with rifles, catching fox and rabbits in makeshift traps. Xavier's encounters with Vietnamese wildlife had reminded him of his peers at the top of the food chain. He had seen men taken in the night by tigers or dragged away by crocodiles while crossing streams. Xavier ran his fingers through his black mane of hair and exhaled. He couldn't imagine a worse death than being eaten alive. He knew that there would be no salvation from an animal attack. Claws would snap through his tendons, fangs would shear off his flesh, and his bones would be crushed like chalk between grinding jaws. During sleepless nights, Xavier often fantasized of dying beneath a hungry tiger. His affirmation of being a fellow predator helped to alleviate these fears, but he always had nightmares. He could still hear the gurgling choke of his old squad mate, Cesatio, as a tiger sliced his throat open with its incisors. He could envision a similar death for himself, in vibrant clarity. Xavier chewed his beard. He didn't voice his opinions, but he believed Ryan had made a grave mistake in setting up camp so soon after his attack. Xavier understood that most predators had large territories. A single tiger could have a territory several miles wide. If they had continued for a few more hours, they may have left the territory of Ryan's attacker. Now they were sitting ducks, an open feast. Xavier squeezed the barrel of his rifle. Xavier felt a sibling rivalry with Ryan. They were the same age and had been in the military for the same amount of time. Xavier knew Ryan was only captain because he was the last surviving member of his original outfit, but it was unfair. Xavier wanted his chance to lead. In his mind's eye, he was a guide in the jungle, a native expert, a hunter and a tracker. He could lead the squad through the most hostile environments, just as his father had led him through the mountains of Maine. Xavier understood the wilderness. Ryan did not. Xavier knew that they were little more than defenseless apes with rifles. If Xavier were in charge, he wouldn't have to keep his eyes open for fear of some unknown beast stalking them in the night. Christ, get it together, Xavier thought. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck bristling. He smoothed them down and held his rifle. He sat upright, scanning the surrounding forest. His eyes adjusted so that he could see the moonlight that seeped through the canopy, settling in the open space between the undergrowth and the treetops. A phantom mist hung in the air. The sounds of the jungle had gradually dwindled away. The rest of the squad was snoring in their tents. Xavier envied them. Xavier checked his watch, 4:50. It was amazing how time could play tricks on the mind. In a matter of hours, the sun would rise, and they would all be safe from further predation. Xavier rubbed his temples. He would be lucky to get any sleep by then. Xavier paused, raising his head to face the forest. The jungle was silent. Xavier lifted his rifle and peered at the mist that lingered in the forest beyond. The longer he stared, the more shapes materialized in the blurry dark. He could faintly detect the moonlight illuminating the space between the trees, giving depth to the flat image of his surroundings. He suddenly felt exposed. The clearing they were camped in was much too open to attack. The pillars of dead trees made it difficult for him to see, and he began to feel angry with Ryan for choosing such a poor campsite. Xavier faced forward and bolted upright. Yellow eyes stared back at him from the forest. Xavier didn't move, didn't breathe. He didn't even think. Fresh sweat damped his clothes. He was transfixed by the cold stare of the amber eyes. At first he thought they might belong to a tiger, but then he watched the eyes climb higher, into the treetops. Xavier knew that tigers rarely climb trees, but a bear would. Xavier would have been content with this theory. A bear wouldn't be so bad. Then he saw another pair of eyes blink open to his left. The M16A1 shook in his hands. Another pair of eyes shone from a tree trunk across the clearing, 30 feet off the ground. Half a dozen eyes watched him from the darkness. Xavier tried to remain calm despite his rapid-fire heartbeat. His eyes jumped around the clearing from one set of eyes to another. The creatures remained in the shadow just beyond the light of the open canopy. Xavier tried to think clearly, but he couldn't. All of his senses were stuck in the enhanced vividness of fight or flight. He could hear the animals sniff in the air like dogs. The M16A was forgotten in his hands. Now it was the same as a crucifix, a symbol to repel evil and keep some sense of sanity in his mind. Thoughts began to appear in overdrive. Are these creatures pack hunters? Are they simply coming together for a feeding frenzy? What are they? How big are they? How fast are they? Am I going to die? Claws skittered across the tree bark above Xavier's head, and splinters rained onto his hammock. All of Xavier's thoughts left him at once. His head slowly tilted back, and he stared up into the eyes of a creature 10 feet above him. The creature's body was outlined in stars. Its body was the size of a wolf, with a thick coat of shining, iridescent feathers, and a long snout filled with glistening fangs. It held onto the tree with a pair of wing-like forearms, and its long tail stood up straight like a flag. Xavier was paralyzed. A whimper choked in his throat. The creature's tail flicked back and forth with the cold excitement of a cat. I'm going to die, Xavier thought. His head fell forward, and he saw several more creatures emerge from the undergrowth. They purred as they approached, their heads bobbing like herons as they moved. Their glowing eyes drifted through the darkness. A few of the creatures sniffed the tents, baring their teeth. Xavier wanted to scream and wake up the others, but he knew this would only incite a bloodbath. He somehow knew that the creatures would be triggered by his screams. There was no escape. They were surrounded. One of the creatures suddenly lifted his head and snorted furiously. He hissed loudly like a burst of steam. The other creatures stopped. They stood on their hind legs, tucked their arms against their sides, and sniffed the air. One of the creatures chuffed, and the animal above Xavier growled. Xavier could see that they were tense. They hopped around on their back legs, glancing at the jungle with jerking movements of their heads. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they scrambled upon the surrounding trees and leapt away, from trunk to trunk, creating a roar of shaking leaves as they went. Xavier watched the treetops until they became still and vacant. He was stunned. Somewhere in the far-off jungle, there was a powerful thump. The ground shook. Xavier jerked his head back up. His hammock swayed between the shivering trees. There was a second thump, like a tree had fallen. The ground shook again. A flock of birds exploded from the distant treetops and spiraled upward, like a flurry of shadows swirling across the pale face of the moon. It seemed like a giant mallet was striking the earth, making it rumble and shake, more powerful with each successive impact. They were footsteps, and they were getting closer. Xavier fell out of his hammock and scrambled on his hands and knees to the closest tent. He grabbed the fabric and shook it wildly. "Eli, Miller, wake up!" Xavier hissed. "Let me in, wake up!" Yeah, Mama, sand, more syrup," Eli grumbled. "Wake up, Eli, you stupid bastard," Xavier growled. The muffled footfalls reverberated through Xavier's bones, and he could hear the trees creaking as they bent away from the powerful force. The footsteps sounded like landmines exploding beneath the soil. He was amazed that the others were able to sleep at all. Xavier scrambled to the other side of the tent and tried to unzip it. The zipper kept slipping out of his jittery, sweaty fingers. The ground stopped rumbling, and the trees swayed at the edge of the clearing. Xavier lay down in the shadow of the tent. Something was breathing heavily from just beyond the stand of trees. It sounded like wind rushing through a cave. Xavier peered around the corner of the tent and caught his breath when he saw the behemoth beyond the campsite. The silhouette of a 20-foot-tall leviathan slowly circled the clearing. Each methodic footstep made the forest shake. Xavier felt his mind retract into a primordial lizard brain, one of only sensation and reaction. He couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. "What the fuck, Xavier?" Eli mumbled. "Shut up, Eli," Xavier silently prayed. The footsteps stopped, and the behemoth hesitated. Xavier held his breath. Maybe he hadn't heard Eli. The air shifted towards Xavier, so they were downwind of the beast. He couldn't smell them, but Xavier was struck by a wave of stench thick with decay, rot, and split blood. He choked back bile. If they were downwind, they might be safe. Xavier couldn't conjure anything other than hope that they were safe. All other thoughts had left him. The behemoth pushed its snout through the canopy and into the clearing. Its blood-stained maw hovered high above the forest floor. Stripes of moonlight were painted across its leathery skin. The jaws were big enough to swallow a man whole. The teeth were like serrated blades. Xavier recognized an elephant's leg in the creature's jaws, a ragged cigar of flesh and broken bone. The behemoth's dull reptilian eyes rolled across the tents. Xavier shrank away from the black eyes and listened to the beast sniff the air. Its powerful chest choked with each breath like a mighty engine. With each huffing snort, Xavier finished closer to the tent. He wished he had his M16A1, but even if he did, it wouldn't make a difference. The creature was as big as a tank. Even Leon's rocket launcher would be useless against it. Somebody stirred inside the tent, and the creature growled lowly. The air trembled around Xavier, and his sphincter tightened. He peeked around the tent and saw the creature standing halfway in the clearing. A scream rose in Xavier's throat, a knee-jerk reaction, but he smothered it behind his hands. He couldn't believe his eyes. There was no way the creature could be real, but there it was. He had seen it a million times before, but not like this. Never in real life. Never alive. The behemoth lifted its head and sniffed the area. Nostrils flexed open and closed on the bulbous end of its snout. A deep growl rumbled in the creature's chest, and the treetops shivered. The creature pulled its head back inside of the jungle, and it turned away, into the depths of the forest. Xavier watched in silence as the behemoth moved through the jungle, as agile as a bird, away and into the darkness. The footsteps gave way to silence. After a few minutes, the jungle returned to life. Xavier listened to the nocturnal animals, familiar animals, and he exhaled. His eyes glared white, and his entire body was shaking. He sat upright and looked around. There weren't any glowing eyes or towering monsters. A terrible realization dawned on him. The behemoth was heading towards Ryan and Leon. Right, thank you guys for watching the video. If any of you are interested in actually reading the book, you can order it online on Amazon. And the general plot of this book is all about a search and rescue team known as Vulture Squad, who are sent into an isolated jungle valley to uncover the fate of a missing Green Beret platoon. As they hunt through the primordial depths of the valley, they discover horrors that not only threaten to unravel their minds, but to end their lives as well. As the casualties mount, the men of Vulture Squad must abandon their human nature and give in to their savage instincts to survive the primitive war.